They laughed when I moved out. Now they're begging for a key to my house. They told me I was ridiculous the moment I packed my last box into the trunk of that second-hand sedan, the one I had saved for with years of part-time jobs and side hustles beneath a life already burdened with resentment. I remember the way their voices clashed, like rusted knives scraping against ceramic, each word dipped in sarcasm and the kind of condescension only familiar blood can wield with such cruel expertise. "You think you're better than us now?" my uncle spat, though he had never offered me more than half-hearted advice and hollow promises. "You'll be back. Probably in a month," my cousin snorted as she scrolled through her phone, too enthralled by the chaos of other people's lives to notice the significance of me leaving mine. And my mother, God bless her disillusioned soul, stood silent, her lips tight with a mixture of exhaustion and shame, unable to muster the strength to defend or damn me. She had long ago sacrificed her voice to survive the noise. The gravel crunched under my tires as I drove away from the cracked driveway of the only home I had ever known, a place that felt less like sanctuary and more like a slow bleed. That house, with its peeling wallpaper and its unspoken rules, had never truly been a home, only a container for generations of bitterness, jealousy, and the suffocating silence that follows emotional abandonment. They didn't see me as someone taking a bold step toward growth. To them, I was the defect, the drama queen, the ungrateful one who thought too highly of their dreams and too little of their place in the family's hierarchy. The thought of someone carving out their own identity, outside the confines of their dysfunction, offended them deeply, not because they believed I would fail, but because a part of them feared I would not. I didn't move into a mansion. I didn't inherit a windfall or stumble upon some charmed career overnight. No. I stepped into a one-bedroom apartment with stained carpets and flickering lights, in a building where the walls whispered every neighbor's argument. But it was mine. I could breathe without monitoring the volume of my laughter, the direction of my thoughts, or the ambitions I dared to voice. I didn't have to justify my solitude or explain the absence of anger in my tone. The silence there didn't scream, it exhaled. The early days weren't easy. There were nights I sat cross-legged on the floor, my only chair a box labeled books, with my dinner resting on a stack of unopened bills. I remember lighting candles not for ambiance, but because the electricity had been cut off after a miscalculation on my part. An error in budgeting that taught me more than any advice my family had ever mumbled between episodes of passive aggression. I walked to work when my car's transmission gave out. I washed dishes in cold water when the boiler stopped working. And I cried. Quietly. Often. But never with the same despair I had known under the roof of people who claimed to love me unconditionally, while setting conditions I could never meet. What they failed to understand was that I didn't leave out of arrogance. I left out of necessity. There's a precise moment when the weight of staying becomes heavier than the fear of leaving. And once that realization crystallizes, it's impossible to unsee. The comfort of familiarity, even when it's corrosive, no longer suffices. I needed air. I needed space to become something other than their scapegoat, their emotional sponge, their living cautionary tale. Years passed. Seasons folded into each other like pages in a well-worn journal, inked with struggle and victories too small for anyone else to notice, but seismic in my world. I built a career not from connections or luck, but from relentless effort. I started as an intern, the kind who fetched coffee and typed meeting notes with fingers trembling from anxiety and underconfidence. But I listened. I learned. I stayed late and arrived early, until eventually, my name was no longer an afterthought but a necessity. I rose slowly, steadily, never skipping steps, never taking for granted the staircase I was ascending. And when I finally signed the mortgage for a house, a real house, with hardwood floors and a garden that would bloom in spring, I cried. Not because I had achieved wealth, but because I had built peace. My name on that deed was a vow. Never again would I return to the chaos I had escaped. The irony? They came crawling back. Not with apologies, not with the kind of remorse that requires vulnerability, but with assumptions cloaked in entitlement. It began with subtle questions during rare phone calls. "How's the house?" my mother asked one day, her voice laced with carefully disguised envy. "Must be nice, having all that space." Then came the requests. My cousin, who once ridiculed my ambition, messaged me about needing a place to crash just for a few weeks after a bad breakup, My uncle, whose voice had bellowed with laughter the day I left, called to ask for a loan, painting his misfortunes as temporary, unlucky blips. Nothing like my own previous struggles, of course. They never acknowledged the past. Never once did they say, "We were wrong." Instead, they acted as though their former ridicule had vanished with time, buried under the convenience of their needs. And as they circled like vultures around the stability I had bled to build, I found myself standing at a precipice once again. This time the choice wasn't between running away and staying. It was between protecting the sanctuary I had cultivated or letting the very forces that once broke me seep through its doors. But something had changed within me, something far more formidable than mere success. I had developed a spine of steel beneath a heart still capable of softness. I had learned the art of discernment, the ability to hold space for compassion without becoming a doormat for those who mistook access for entitlement. I could hear their voices, still tinged with subtle mockery and lingering disbelief, and yet I remained unmoved, because while they still saw the version of me they had tried to shatter, I had long since shed that skin. I was no longer the runaway. I was the architect of a new life, and they, those who laughed when I moved out, were now at the gate, knocking, pretending they had always believed in me. And I wasn't sure if I was ready to answer. It began with an envelope. Not the digital kind that lit up my inbox like static in a storm, but a real one. Creased, worn at the corners, the flap sealed with a slight unevenness that suggested haste or hesitation. It arrived in my mailbox on a Tuesday, tucked between credit card advertisements and the city council newsletter I never read. The handwriting on the front was familiar, though aged by time and frayed by what I could only guess was reluctance. My mother's cursive had always been precise, each letter neatly married to the next, but this time it wobbled with something fragile. I opened it not with excitement but with a calculated caution, the kind you reserve for old wounds that might still sting. Inside were 6 lines. No formal greeting, no apology, no direct address. Just a scattered thread of words that vaguely asked about my well-being, and then segued, almost apologetically, into a request. She wrote that things had been difficult lately, that the old house had sprung new leaks, literal and metaphorical, and that maybe, just maybe, she might visit. Sometime, if it's not too much trouble. The words sat on the page like nervous guests, unsure whether they were welcome. I held the letter for a long moment, not reading it again, just letting its weight settle into my fingers like ash. I didn't respond, not immediately, not with guilt. Instead, I folded the letter and slid it into the drawer beside my bed, the one filled with things I wasn't sure what to do with. Birthday cards I never opened, a pair of earrings gifted by someone I no longer speak to, a Polaroid of my childhood bedroom before I stripped the wallpaper and painted it over with hope. That drawer had become an archive of emotional ambiguity, and now the letter had found its place among the relics. But of course, silence is never really silent in families like mine. It echoes, and mine resounded like thunder in the halls of their denial. 2 weeks later, my cousin showed up at my door. She didn't call first, just appeared, standing on the steps of the house I had carved out of sweat and solitude, clutching a duffel bag and a styrofoam cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. Her face bore the polished exhaustion of someone trying to maintain dignity while begging for grace. I didn't recognize her immediately, not because she had changed dramatically. She still wore the same thick eyeliner and had her hair pulled into that high, casual bun she thought made her look carefree, but because she was out of context. The last time we had spoken, she'd told me over the din of a family barbecue that I thought I was better than everyone, and that real life would chew me up and spit me out. Apparently, real life had spat her out first. "I just need a place for a few nights," she said, her voice flat but not cold, like someone trying to suppress panic beneath practiced nonchalance. I wouldn't ask, but things have been messed up. I left Kyle, for good this time, and I don't want to go back to Mom's. I looked at her for a long while, not out of anger, but to gauge the honesty in her voice. It wasn't remorse I saw in her eyes. It was exhaustion, the kind I knew well, the kind that made you move through days like a shadow of yourself, apologizing for breathing too loud, for needing too much. I let her in, not because I forgave her, and certainly not because I had forgotten,
but because there's a mercy that comes from knowing what it feels like to have nowhere else to go.
I showed her to the guest room, a space I had once filled with dreams of hosting writers' retreats or friends passing through. She didn't say thank you, not that night, not the next morning, but her silence felt heavier than gratitude. For the first few days, she floated in and out of the house like a ghost in someone else's memory. She offered to do dishes, folded her sheets with obsessive precision, and never left a light on after leaving a room. I saw in her the habits of someone who had spent too long apologizing for her presence, and I couldn't help but wonder what had broken inside her. She didn't talk about Kyle. She didn't talk about our family. She mostly kept to herself, eyes glued to the glow of her phone or to the steam of her coffee cup. Until the night she didn't. We were sitting on the back porch, the air heavy with the scent of jasmine and the distant hum of summer insects. She broke the silence with a whisper so faint I almost thought it was the wind. You ever feel like no matter how far you run, the past is just sitting there, waiting? I didn't respond at first, because yes, I had felt that. Not just once, but endlessly. Each time a familiar voice popped up on my phone, each time I heard the word home and felt a chill instead of warmth. I had felt it in the way my mother's voice still echoed in my sleep, in the way I sometimes hesitated to laugh too loudly even in my own space, as if I might be reprimanded for joy. I stayed too long, she continued, more to herself than to me. In that house, with him, with all of them. I thought if I just waited, they'd change, that maybe they'd see me. I looked at her then, really looked. I saw the vulnerability beneath her armor, and I realized something bitter. We were both victims of the same story, just cast in different roles. They only see what they need, I said quietly, not who you are. She nodded. Her eyes glistened but didn't fall into tears. She wasn't that kind of person. Neither was I anymore. Over the next few weeks, we developed a rhythm. It wasn't friendship. Not yet. It was more like an armistice, a truce born from shared silence and cautious steps. She found a job at a local bookstore, started saving money, and left applications open on the kitchen counter with hopeful post-it notes. I let her stay. Not because I wanted her to, but because I needed to see if healing could happen in small doses, even with fractured histories. Then came the knock, a soft, deliberate rap against the front door one Sunday morning. 3 taps, like a memory trying to make itself heard. I opened it and found my mother standing there, a tote bag slung over one shoulder, her cardigan mismatched with her shoes. She looked smaller than I remembered, not physically, but in the way a statue looks smaller when you finally see the cracks in its foundation. She smiled, hesitant. I didn't know if you'd open the door. Neither did I. She stepped inside as though the house might reject her presence, her eyes scanning the hallway, the furniture, the photos on the mantel. She paused when she saw the framed quote I'd hung in the foyer. Sometimes the family you build matters more than the one you're born into. Her mouth twitched, but she said nothing. We sat in the kitchen, the one I'd renovated with light wood and sunlight in mind, trying to fill it with brightness I never had as a child. She sipped the tea I made without asking her preference, and I watched her try to shrink herself into politeness. I miss you, she said eventually. We all do. I wanted to ask who we meant. The same people who had laughed when I left? The ones who called my independence betrayal? I wanted to ask, but I didn't, because I knew her visit had little to do with reconciliation. She didn't come for closure. She came for access. And there, nestled between her lines of half-hearted affection and veiled regret, was the truth she didn't know how to say. They needed me now. They had spent years dismissing my departure, framing it as abandonment, selfishness, rebellion. And now, as their world tilted beneath the weight of their own missteps, I had become the lighthouse. Not because they saw my worth, but because they had lost sight of their own direction. She asked before she left whether she could visit more often, whether she could have a key, just in case. The words hung in the air like smoke, clouding everything. I didn't answer. Not yet. But I could feel the weight of the question settling into the walls of the home I had built from nothing. And I knew the next chapter would demand more than just forgiveness. It would demand reckoning. There's something unsettling about watching your past try to make itself comfortable in your present. It's not loud, not sudden. It creeps in with subtle gestures, familiar glances, and the occasional, almost accidental use of your childhood nickname. My mother began to visit with an ease that unsettled me. At first, she asked. Then she announced. I would receive a text, stopping by, and within an hour she'd be on the porch with some excuse, delivering leftovers, dropping off a magazine she thought I'd like, bringing over an old photo she claimed I should frame. Each time she came with the aura of a guest pretending to be a host, rearranging cushions she didn't own, commenting on decor choices as though her opinion had always been invited. My cousin noticed it too. She kept her distance when my mother visited, staying tucked in the guest room or leaving the house under the guise of errands. We had grown into a quiet, tentative alliance by then, built not on fondness, but shared recognition of the way our family had shaped and splintered us. One evening, after my mother had come and gone, leaving behind a casserole and a subtle dig about how quiet the house felt without more life in it, my cousin sat beside me in the living room, her expression tight with unspoken truths. She wants to move in, she said, not as a question but a statement, like she had already glimpsed the playbook and skipped ahead to the next act. I didn't respond, not because I didn't believe it, but because I had already sensed it. The lingering gaze down the hallway, the idle comments about how that room could be cozy with the right touch, the way her eyes paused on the empty hooks by the front door. It wasn't just nostalgia she was bringing, it was intention, a soft invasion, wrapped in maternal guilt and veiled suggestions. I found myself caught in a peculiar vortex of guilt and resentment. My instinct screamed to slam every door, to bolt every window of my life shut against the same people who once treated my dreams like a punchline. But somewhere, lodged in the marrow of my upbringing, was that old, gnawing compulsion to be good, to be the one who rises above, who forgives, who makes space even when there is none left. That conflict simmered in every interaction. When my uncle called, pretending casual interest in how I was doing before bringing up the foreclosure on his second home, I felt it. When my mother brought over old trinkets from my childhood, clearly trying to cement her presence in the house, I felt it. And when I caught my cousin Googling apartments late at night, trying to figure out how to leave without overstaying her welcome, I felt it most acutely. The crushing awareness that I had become the refuge, the fallback plan, the person everyone now believed should open their arms without question. They didn't ask for forgiveness. They asked for access. And there's a vast difference. One evening, it came to a head. My mother arrived earlier than expected, let herself in with the spare key I'd given her months ago for emergencies. I had forgotten she still had it. The sound of the front door clicking open as I emerged from the shower startled me more than I cared to admit. She stood in the foyer with a smile that wavered when she saw my face. I figured I'd surprise you, she said, holding a bag of groceries like it was an olive branch. I didn't smile. You should have called. Her eyes darted around, unsettled. I thought we were past all that. I'm your mother. There it was. The phrase that justified all transgressions. The master key. I'm your mother. As if those words alone were enough to eclipse every cutting comment, every dismissal, every time she stood silent while others diminished me. You're not entitled to walk into my life just because you share my blood, I said, more evenly than I felt. Her face changed. The smile collapsed into itself, replaced by that look she always wore when I defied her. A cocktail of disbelief, hurt, and wounded pride. So that's it? After everything I did for you? I wanted to laugh. Not because it was funny, but because the script was so predictable. The years I spent scraping together independence were now framed as betrayal, and her absence during my struggle was replaced by the illusion that she had somehow been silently supporting me all along. What exactly did you do for me? I asked, genuinely, not sarcastically. You watched me drown and told me not to make waves. Her lips pressed into a thin line. You always were dramatic. And there it was again, dismissal dressed as critique. The conversation unraveled quickly after that, with raised voices and half-truths hurled like weapons. She accused me of being cold, ungrateful, distant. I reminded her that distance was the only thing that had allowed me to survive. By the time she left, the air in the house felt scorched. My cousin found me later, sitting on the back steps, staring at the garden that had once seemed like the symbol of my peace. "She doesn't get it," she said, handing me a glass of water. "She never did." "No," I agreed, "but that doesn't mean I have to keep letting her try." That night, I changed the locks, not out of anger, out of necessity. It was one of the most quietly radical acts of my life, and the fallout I knew would come. 2 days later, I received a group message from my aunt, a woman who had never spoken to me directly without a sneer or a sideways insult, now laced with saccharine concern and barely veiled condemnation. "I heard you locked your own mother out of your life. This is not who we raised you to be." We. The illusion that I was theirs, that my choices were betrayals not of values, but of ownership. I didn't reply. I didn't have to, because by then, the house had become more than just a physical space. It was a boundary, a statement, a living testament to the life I had carved without permission, without applause, without their help. And they hated that it existed. They hated that I existed, outside their definitions, their control, their narrative. But still, they came, one by one. Cousins who needed references for jobs, aunties who wanted help enrolling their kids in better schools, uncles who whispered about investments and opportunities that required just a little help to get started. None of them asked how I was. None of them acknowledged the years I spent invisible. To them, I had become visible only now, only when I had something they needed. And I, standing in the threshold of all that I had built, began to realize something profound. I was not obligated to set myself on fire to keep them warm. Not anymore. Not ever again. The first time I truly noticed the way silence rearranges itself inside a house was during the 3rd week of November, when the last of the sycamore leaves clung to the trees like stubborn memories. The mornings came cooler, sharper, and the air in the house began to hold a kind of echo that felt unfamiliar, not because it was new, but because it was finally honest. The absence of my mother's uninvited footsteps, the silence that replaced the sound of her rearranging objects that weren't hers to touch. These gaps in the auditory rhythm of the house revealed themselves like ghosts finally seen in the light. And with every passing day, I could feel the house adjusting its breath, settling back into itself, like a body recovering from an intrusive touch. But peace, like all precious things, never arrives without a cost. After I changed the locks and my silence echoed louder than their accusations, a new kind of pressure began to build, less direct, more insidious. It began with voicemails, the kind laced in theatrical pauses and carefully choreographed concern. My aunt left the first one, her voice steeped in a sanctimonious tone I remembered from holidays spent under surveillance. She spoke of family, like it was a contract I'd broken, a sacred duty I had defaulted on. Then came the messages from old cousins, people who had never texted me without mockery or passive aggression, suddenly speaking in a language soaked in sentimentality. "We were just kids back then. We didn't know better. You've changed, but we all have. Isn't it time we start fresh?" Forgiveness had become their currency, not something they offered, but something they demanded, cheapened by their convenience and sterilized of any real accountability. I ignored them, not because I held hatred, but because their apologies came wrapped in revisionist history. They wanted absolution without confession. They wanted entry without penance. My cousin, the one still living in my guest room, remained mostly quiet about the unfolding family spectacle. She worked long hours now, a string of double shifts at the bookstore followed by freelance gigs editing online articles. She came home exhausted, but carried herself with a growing steadiness, the kind that forms when a person starts to believe they're allowed to take up space. One night, I found her sitting at the dining table, surrounded by job applications and apartment listings, her laptop screen flickering with hope. She looked up when she heard me and offered a small smile. "I think I found a place," she said, her voice hesitant but resolute. I walked over and glanced at the listing. It was modest, not much larger than the guest room she occupied now, but it was hers, or would be soon. She looked proud, and underneath that pride, a cautious fear, the kind born of starting over when you've already been burned. I nodded, and I felt something unspoken pass between us. Not forgiveness, not friendship, but recognition. "Good," I said. "You deserve your own space." That weekend, she moved out. No fanfare, no dramatic farewell. She packed her things in the quiet morning light, loaded the car with books and bags and carefully folded clothes. Before she left, she turned to me in the driveway, her expression unreadable. "I don't know if I ever said thank you." "You didn't have to," I replied, but she did anyway. After she left, the house fell into a deeper silence, this time not the absence of chaos, but the presence of solitude. And since I had claimed this space as my own, I felt the full weight of its stillness settle into my bones. It was in that silence that the letters began, handwritten, not typed, each one unsigned, though the handwriting was unmistakably my mother's, neat, practiced, like a schoolteacher correcting someone else's life. She didn't address me by name. She didn't apologize. The letters were riddled with memories, cherry-picked and carefully framed, designed to remind me of the times she believed she had been good, nurturing, kind. There were mentions of birthday cakes and bandages, of sleepless nights spent by my childhood bed. She cataloged the moments that made her feel like a mother and ignored the ones that made me feel abandoned. It was a strange kind of erasure, one that didn't deny the past but re-edited it to suit her narrative. I didn't respond. Instead, I stored the letters in a box in the back of my closet, beside the old shoebox filled with notes I'd once written to myself in secret. Reminders that I was real, that my pain wasn't imagined, that leaving had been necessary even when it felt like betrayal. As the days passed and winter crept in, I began to notice other things. People I hadn't spoken to in years started appearing in my digital periphery. Friend requests, follows, comments on old photos. People who had watched me leave without a word now attempting to circle back with casual familiarity. One cousin messaged me directly, saying he was proud of how far I'd come and that he'd always known I'd make it. I stared at the message for 10 full minutes, remembering how he used to call me names so cruel they echoed in my ears for days. I deleted the message. It was around this time that I began to see the full architecture of their strategy. Not reconciliation, but reclamation. I had become a symbol to them, a monument to endurance they wanted to reattach themselves to, as if their proximity to my survival would redeem their silence, their cruelty, their complicity. They weren't seeking me. They were seeking absolution through association. And I would not be their redemption. One particularly cold afternoon, I received a visit I hadn't expected. My younger brother, the golden child, the one who had always remained tethered to their approval, the one who had inherited the weight of their expectations and worn it like armor. We hadn't spoken in nearly 3 years. The last time I saw him, he told me I was selfish for walking away. That family didn't mean walking out when things got hard. He arrived without warning, just like the rest of them. But unlike the others, he didn't bring anything. No casseroles, no guilt-laced tokens. Just himself, taller than I remembered, a little gaunt around the eyes, his expression unusually devoid of certainty. "I don't want anything," he said as I opened the door. "I just need to talk." Against my better judgment, I let him in. We sat in the living room, the space now framed with plants that had grown wildly under my care. Soft rugs, the warm hum of low music. He glanced around, his eyes touching everything like a stranger taking inventory. "This place feels like you," he said after a long pause. I didn't reply. I was waiting for the pivot, the moment when the conversation would shift from honesty to performance. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "I didn't come here for them. I know what they're doing. I know they're trying to rewrite everything." "And what do you want from me?" I asked. "Nothing," he said. "I swear, I wanted to understand." "Understand what?" "How you did it, how you left, how you made it feel like you didn't need any of us." His voice cracked slightly at the end, and for a brief moment, I saw the boy I used to sneak cookies to under the dinner table, the one who used to crawl into my room at night when the shouting got too loud. And suddenly, I realized something painful and luminous. Not everyone who stayed behind did so out of loyalty. Some stayed because they had nowhere else to go, because fear held them hostage, because leaving would have required a kind of strength they didn't believe they had. I looked at him and saw not an enemy, but a prisoner who had finally found a crack in the wall. "It wasn't easy," I said quietly. "It still isn't." He nodded slowly. "I wish I'd followed you." I didn't tell him it wasn't too late. He would have to find that out for himself. He left not long after, and I didn't ask him to stay. But as I closed the door behind him, I felt the house exhale again. This time, not in relief, but in gentle acknowledgement. The past was not gone, but it was no longer the architect of my present. Still, even as I tried to reclaim my peace, the world outside kept reaching in. One morning, as frost painted the windows in delicate filigree, I received a formal letter from an attorney. It was a notice. My mother was attempting to claim partial ownership of the house. Apparently, she had contributed a sum of money, years ago, back when I was first scrambling to escape, when I had borrowed $500 for the down payment on the land this house now stood upon. I had repaid it in full. In fact, I had repaid it with interest. But none of that mattered now. She had found a loophole, or thought she had, and with that single letter, the conflict transformed. It was no longer emotional. It was legal, strategic, war disguised in paperwork and civility, and I, who had built my sanctuary with bare hands and burning lungs, now stood on the precipice of a new fight. One I had not asked for, one I would not lose. The law is a peculiar thing. Cold, unfeeling, wrapped in language that demands interpretation, yet devoid of the nuances that shape a life. I sat across from my attorney, a woman whose voice held the kind of practiced steadiness that suggested she'd seen 1,000 different variations of this story. Family turned adversary, generosity rebranded as liability, and the slow corrosion of boundaries under the weight of entitlement. She read through the claim my mother had filed without flinching, her finger trailing each sentence like a needle stitching through fabric I no longer wanted to touch. "She's asserting equitable interest," the attorney said, her voice flat. "She's arguing that her financial contribution, no matter how small or repaid, entitles her to a percentage of the property's equity." I didn't speak. I simply stared at the document. Those pages stamped and notarized, cloaked in legalese, yet more emotionally violent than any insult my family had ever hurled. My mother hadn't come to my door to speak. She hadn't called to plead. She had filed a claim, turned me into a defendant, transformed our bloodline into a battleground. And in doing so, she revealed the truth I had always suspected but never dared articulate, that to her, I was never a child with dreams, only a resource to be reclaimed. I remembered the moment I had accepted that $500. I was 23, exhausted, barely sleeping between 2 part-time jobs and a freelancing gig that barely kept the lights on. My credit had been a mosaic of student loan debt and missed rent payments. When the opportunity came to buy a plot of land on the outskirts of the city, a miracle priced low due to a zoning dispute, I jumped. I had enough to cover the majority of the down payment, but fell short by a sliver. That was when I called her. Not because I wanted to, but because I had no one else. She answered on the 3rd ring, her voice clipped, already suspicious. She sent the money without a lecture, but with an unspoken implication. This was her investment, not her gift. And even when I repaid her in full 6 months later, along with more interest than the loan was ever worth, I could feel her still holding it like leverage tucked in her pocket. Now, all these years later, she had decided to cash in on that leverage, not out of desperation, but spite. "She doesn't want the house," I said finally, my voice barely audible. "She just wants to remind me it's never really mine." The attorney nodded slowly, as if confirming something she had already deduced. "We'll fight it. It won't be easy, but your paperwork is solid. You have proof of repayment, statements, everything documented." But it wasn't the legal fight that frightened me. It was the emotional erosion I felt creeping back in. The way her claim seemed to whisper doubt into my carefully constructed world. Suddenly the walls of the house felt more fragile, the windows thinner, the foundation shakier. How do you protect yourself from someone who gave you life, but keeps trying to take it back in pieces? Over the next few weeks, the case loomed like a storm cloud. I went through the motions of daily life, waking, working, cooking, sleeping, but everything felt shrouded in a fog of tension. Each envelope in the mail, each unknown number on my phone, felt like a possible escalation. I stopped inviting friends over. I pulled back from social events. I found myself wandering the rooms of the house late at night, touching the walls like they might vanish if I didn't anchor them with my hands. The house, once a symbol of freedom, now felt like a battlefield under siege. It wasn't just the legal process that wore me down. It was the ripple effect. Word had spread. Family I hadn't seen in years suddenly had opinions. Some called me selfish. Others accused me of dishonoring my mother. A few, in their convoluted way, tried to stay neutral, urging me to find a peaceful resolution, as though peace could exist where respect had long been evicted. Social media posts surfaced. Vague, passive-aggressive barbs clearly directed at me, cloaked in quotes about forgiveness and loyalty. Old friends I hadn't spoken to since college began liking my mother's posts about the pain of being alienated by your own blood. Even the people who meant well didn't seem to grasp the depth of the wound. "She's your mother," they said, as if that absolved everything, as if the title came with immunity from consequence. I began to dream of escape again, not the frantic, desperate kind that had led me to flee my family in the first place, but a quiet, methodical kind. I fantasized about selling the house, changing my name, disappearing to a town where no one knew my history, where I could walk into a coffee shop and not wonder who there had read the latest rumor about me. But even as I entertained the thought, I knew I wouldn't do it. Leaving again would mean surrendering the very thing I had fought to claim. So instead, I fortified. I tightened my circles. I upgraded my home security. I removed the spare key hidden under the third brick on the porch. I changed my phone number. I cleared out the old journals and letters and burned them in the fireplace, not out of anger, but out of necessity, like cauterizing a wound to stop the infection. And slowly, the house began to breathe again. The legal proceedings dragged on. My attorney was sharp, persistent, unrelenting in her dismantling of my mother's claim. Each time I sat across from her in the conference room, I felt a little more grounded, like the roots I had planted here were pushing deeper into the earth. I submitted bank records, signed affidavits, recounted timelines with clinical precision. I built a case not just in the eyes of the court, but in the quiet chambers of my own mind, a reaffirmation that this life, this home, this sanctuary was mine. Not by accident, not by inheritance, but by choice, by labor, by unrelenting self-preservation. My mother never showed up to any of the hearings. She let her lawyer speak for her, let the system do the dirty work. I wondered if she watched from a distance, if she waited for some crack to appear in my resolve, if she expected me to cave under the pressure, to call her crying, to beg for reconciliation. But that call never came. Because I was not that child anymore. I no longer sought approval. I no longer mistook proximity for love. The ruling finally came on a gray Friday afternoon. I won. The judge dismissed the claim, declared her contribution a loan, fully repaid. No equity, no entitlement, no foot in the door. I didn't celebrate. I didn't call anyone. I didn't post about it. Instead, I walked out of the courthouse, drove home in silence, and sat on my porch for hours, watching the sky shift from pewter to charcoal, the air heavy with the promise of rain. And in that silence, I realized something I hadn't dared acknowledge before. This wasn't the end of the war. It was just the latest battle. They would come again, maybe not with lawsuits or letters, but with manipulation, with nostalgia, with guilt shaped like affection. They would test the edges of my boundaries, looking for weak spots. They would ask for small favors, rebrand demands as kindness, and slip old language into new contexts, hoping I wouldn't notice the sleight of hand. But I was not who I used to be. This house had taught me something. Peace isn't the absence of conflict. It's the presence of clarity, and clarity was something I had earned, inch by inch, breath by breath. They could knock, they could plead, they could write their own versions of the story and read them aloud in whatever echo chambers would have them. But the door stayed locked, and I held the only key. There comes a moment, often imperceptible at first, when the storm finally passes. Not with a crash, nor a cry, but in the quiet softening of the air. After months steeped in a battle that was never just about legalities or property lines, but rather the sovereignty of my own autonomy, I found myself awakening to a strange, unfamiliar sensation: stillness. The lawsuit had ended. The voices had dulled. The endless orbit of betrayal had finally spun itself into a pause. Yet I didn't feel triumphant, or even relieved. I felt something deeper, quieter, something that came from the marrow rather than the mind. It was closure, not handed to me by anyone else, not gifted by apology or acknowledgement, but earned, an inward sealing of old wounds, stitched not with reconciliation, but with self-respect. Winter was dissolving by then. The last of the frost had surrendered to rain, and the plum tree in the backyard was beginning to unfurl its pale blossoms, defiant and fragrant. My days unfolded without intrusion. I worked, I read, I walked through my house barefoot, no longer tiptoeing through rooms haunted by the memory of voices that had once claimed dominion over my worth. And in that daily simplicity, I rebuilt something far more lasting than just a house. I rebuilt trust. Trust in myself, in my discernment, in the boundaries I had once been shamed for needing. There were no more letters, no more calls. The silence from my mother's end was not born of remorse, but of retreat. I knew her well enough to understand she had not changed, only recalculated. I imagined she had shifted the narrative, now telling others I had become impossible, ungrateful, the child who turned their back on blood. It didn't matter. Her story was no longer mine to counter. I no longer lived in reaction to her distortions. I had surrendered the need to defend myself against voices determined to misunderstand me. My brother never returned, not to my doorstep, not to my inbox. His visit had been a rupture, a brief flicker of something almost vulnerable, but in the end, he too retreated into silence. Perhaps guilt swallowed his resolve. Perhaps his allegiance to our mother was too ingrained to unravel. Perhaps he had merely been passing through, testing the waters but not ready to swim. I stopped waiting for him. I stopped waiting for anyone. The final shift came unexpectedly. I had just returned from a long walk, mud-stained boots, cheeks flushed with wind, when I saw it. A small envelope resting against the front door. No postage, no name, just plain white, slightly crumpled at the corners. I stood there for a long while before picking it up, turning it over in my hands like something both sacred and suspicious. Eventually I opened it. Inside was a single note, written in tight, deliberate handwriting I recognized immediately. I don't expect forgiveness. I just hope you live well. That's all I ever really wanted, even if I couldn't show it the right way. Mom. It wasn't an apology, not really. There were no specifics, no mention of the years she had spent tearing me down, the manipulations, the lawsuit, the fractures she'd deepened with every action. It wasn't accountability, but it wasn't war either. It was a white flag, limp and ambiguous, but offered nonetheless. I sat on the porch with the note in my lap, watching the horizon bleed into dusk. There was a time, years ago, when a letter like this would have cracked me wide open, when the mere suggestion of her love, however twisted, would have sent me running back into the fire, desperate to rewrite history with enough kindness to finally make her proud. But that time had passed. I was no longer a child begging to be seen. I was no longer someone who mistook pain for love. I folded the note and placed it inside a drawer, not to hold on to, but to remember. Not all acknowledgments need to be embraced. Some simply need to be observed and set aside. Spring arrived in earnest after that, slowly painting the world in green and gold. The house shifted with the season. I opened the windows. I repainted the kitchen in a deeper hue of slate, hung shelves in the study, planted lavender along the path leading to the front steps. Each act was small but declarative. This space is mine. This life is mine. And no one will ever take that from me again. It was a quiet morning in early April when I received an invitation. Not from family, from myself. I stood in the center of the living room, sunlight tracing lines across the floorboards, and I decided it was time. Time to reintroduce joy into the house. Not cautiously, not temporarily, but fully. I sent out messages to the people who had remained, friends, colleagues, distant cousins who had chosen to stand on the side of respect rather than history. I invited them to a dinner, not a celebration, a gathering, a reclamation of community. That evening, the house was filled with voices. Laughter echoed in the walls where once only tension had lived. Glasses clinked. Music drifted through the open windows. The kitchen, once a place I had tiptoed through in fear of judgment, now brimmed with the scent of roasted rosemary chicken, cinnamon pears, and cardamom tea. There was warmth, not forced or theatrical, but genuine. The kind born of connection that asks nothing of you but your presence. At one point, I stepped out onto the porch to breathe, to take it all in. The house glowed behind me. Inside, someone was telling a story that made everyone laugh. Someone else was lighting candles along the windowsill. And I stood in the quiet hum of twilight, truly free. Not in spite of everything that had happened, but because of it. I had been forged in the crucible of expectation and escape. I had learned to build not just walls, but doors. And more importantly, how to decide who gets to enter. My family had once mocked my departure, laughed at my dreams, warned that I'd return broken and begging. And now, I stood on a threshold of my own design, not begging, not broken, not bitter. Just whole. The house didn't need locks anymore, not out of fear, but because it knew its keeper. It knew who belonged and who didn't. And so did I. That night, after everyone had left and the rooms were hushed once more, I walked through the house slowly, hand tracing along the walls as though reacquainting myself with an old friend. Each room held a story. Not all were happy, but all were honest. And that honesty was worth everything. I returned to the porch, where the stars had begun their quiet shimmer. The night air was cool, laced with jasmine and dew. I sat there for a long time, listening to the soft sounds of a world finally in harmony. And I realized with a calmness so profound it startled me. The story was over, not in defeat, not in tragedy, but in triumph. Not loud, not brash, just true. I had moved out. I had built a life, and I had become the person they never believed I could be. They had laughed. But now I didn't need them to ask for a key, because I finally understood. I was the lock, and I was the door, and I was never opening it for them again.